Yes. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Thursday book launch. We've actually gotten to celebrate with Judy before, but tonight I'm particularly really excited about this. My name is Malika Albrecht. I'm the founding editor of Redheaded Stepchild, a magazine that only takes poems that have been rejected elsewhere. And if you've never sent me work, please do. And go to the most recent issue. Regina has a poem on there. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Judy, and then we're going to move real forward. I'm not going to read a lengthy bio because I really want to get to the meat of this, which is, of course, hearing Judy read. Judy Kronenfeld's 6 full-length books of poetry include If Only There Were Stations of the Air, we celebrated. Groaning and Singing, also we celebrated. Words Flying Through the Banquet. We were, this was before I was doing something wise like this. Yeah, I would have loved to have celebrated that. Shimmer and Light Lowering in Diminished Sevenths. And that was a second edition, by the way. It was the winner of the 2007 Litchfield Review Poetry Book Prize. Her third chapbook, which also we adore, Oh Memory, You Unlocked Cabinet of Amazements. Any of these you can Google, also go to her website and see more information about it if you're interested. And then tonight, if you want the newest book, Apartness, you can go to Barnes and Nobles or Inlandia. Her poems have appeared in such journals as Cimarron Review, DMQ Review, MacQueen's Quinterly, New Ohio Review, Rattle, and One Art. I am going to turn it over promptly to Judy, and y'all, welcome. You're in for a treat. Thank you so much, Judy, for being here.
It's my pleasure, Malika. I just adore your group. It's always welcoming. I truly find it special, and I'm so glad to be here. This is a different kind of reading for me because I usually read poems, and it's one essay I'm going to read, one somewhat lengthy essay. But let me tell you a tiny bit about the book first. Apartness is composed of essays that mostly have been published over a very long period of time. So about 1994 to 2022. So they were written at different places in my life, and each of them is really belongs to that particular moment. And sometimes that moment can conflict with other moments that are described in the book. So there's change because we are constantly changing. And there's also a certain ambivalence at times about sometimes very important things. But I guess the central theme is the idea of apartness, meaning the idea of feeling left out or not at home, the opposite of feeling at home, which I assume everyone experiences in one context or another in their lives, except for the members of the present administration, of course. So, different themes reoccur in this book. One is travel, particularly to France, and I'm going to read an essay called Speaking French, which is about a trip that my husband and I made to France in 1993-94, an extended stay in a small town in France. Speaking French. When I speak French on our relatively rare trips to France, a language I studied somewhat desultorily for 4 years in high school and a year or so in college long ago, the words I am speaking pass before my eyes as if moving across a screen. As I round my lips for the vowels, feel my nose tighten for the nasalization, the words glide by on a schoolgirl's mental moving blackboard, accompanied by their bizarre fantails of mysterious or silent letters reflecting older pronunciations or Latin antecedents. Journaux, A-U-X, bateau, E-A-U, fauteuil, E-U-I-L, though I know how to say and do say journaux, bateau, fauteuil. My husband has never studied the language formally, but has picked up a thimbleful on the street. Of course, he hears j'aime as if it were each noun and verb part ended with the letter M. J'aime, to M, ils aiment, whereas I see j'aime, A-I-M-E, to M, A-I-M-E-S, ils aiment, A-I-M-E-N-T. It's as if his French is a kind of pig Latin. This moving mental blackboard does not disappear when I've grown a bit more accustomed to speaking French, nor does it produce an annoying sensation. On the contrary, it is more than a pleasant one. It is a constant reaffirmation, a pat myself on the back, smile at the world pleasure. Just asking for my bread at La Boulangerie, buying my wine at La Cave au Vin, I have managed to cross the gated divide between the letters of French words and their actual pronunciation. I ask the severe and proper madame in her white apron, punctiliously waiting on the pressing crowd in the bakery for une à l'ancienne, ever so slightly prolonging the final nasal. And she sings back, une à l'ancienne, without blinking an eye, emphasizing her own final syllable just a pinch more, in that way the French have of making even the most mundane conversation into a subtle language lesson. I know I have passed yet another test, and I feel like waving my good grades at the universe. France, the one place my husband and I have attempted to live exclusively in a foreign language, is located in the mouth for me, as much because of these high rewards I garner when I speak, as because of the pleasures of eating its cuisine, including the horns of the warm, crisp on the outside, soft on the inside, loaf of bread à l'ancienne that never made it to the picnic intact. Yet why do I have this memory of a daily glow of accomplishment, a centering focus, even from our fourth trip to France, a brief dash a couple of years ago, a couple of years from 1994, and not from stops in Spain where I can get along in pidgin Spanish or even in French-speaking Quebec? It probably has something, if not everything, to do with my interiorization of the particular kind of extended stay we had in France for the 9 months of an academic year in 1993, 1994. It was a hiatus from our middle-aged lives, an unorthodox sabbatical for my anthropologist husband, a leave of absence from my insecure part-time university teaching job for me, when both of us were sick of the politics of academe and sick of having our egos continually on the line. We were carrying out a plan we'd failed to carry out 15 years before when our children were little and it had proved too awesomely complicated. It was still complicated. Extended stay visa applications for the consulate in LA had to be in 12-plicate, in ink, in perfect French with no crossouts. And it got more complicated once we arrived. Car registration required the permanent address we didn't have when we bought our used car. But at least we had only ourselves to look out for, no schools to arrange, pediatricians to procure. We did have our laptops, more complications to set those up, and our work. But otherwise, we were radically cut off from our multi-tentacled and hugely object-filled American lives, and almost guiltlessly 6,000 miles away from my aging parents who had moved to our city almost a decade before, when we finally plunked down in an apartment with few amenities in a little unglitzy beach town on the Côte d'Azur. An oxymoron, you may think, but they exist, those unglitzy beach towns, like beach towns almost everywhere. Slightly tarnished and seedy looking. This one was undistinguished enough to be frequented in the summer only by French folks from further north, And it was a town where no one we knew lived, not even the extraordinarily charming polyglot French anthropologist we met in Paris, who encouraged us to go south and helped us find our place. His was about 40 minutes away. Of course, to be suddenly living in exotic French was definitely more dislocating than pleasurable at first. My heavy tongue seemed to flail about in my mouth, like a person who can't find the right position for sleep. And it was difficult to settle into the idea of actually living and working at my projects in a place whose texture was not in my fingertips, the rhythms of whose weeks were not in my blood, and which therefore could give no shape to my life, and yet whose strangeness at first refused to be backgrounded. Small things distracted me. The light switch that would not fade into inconsequentiality and be flicked on without my thinking as it would have at home, but instead continued to call attention to itself with its annoying position outside the room the light fixture actually lit, and its peculiar little fuse right there in the switch plate. That sense of dislocating strangeness, that suspension in time and space, is what travelers travel for. It gives permission on a brief vacation to not worry about one's usual responsibilities, one's usual self, to imagine change. But I needed ultimately to get on with the academic work I was then deeply into, and to accomplish that, I had to be released into the forgetfulness of the familiar and taken for granted. Instead, I floundered in a confused time warp. In the morning, in the old-fashioned kitchen with its stove and sink on legs, we tried to get the BBC on our shortwave radio, the accent and scene throwing me back into movie or were they life images of the 40s and early 50s. A woman in a checked gingham apron with her hair in big loops behind each ear and puffed bangs over her forehead belonged in that kitchen. Or perhaps what I was feeling as I hunted around for a label for the atmosphere and tried to acclimate myself was the climate of my dissertation research here in England in the late 60s, when my husband and I, then also without children, the children we hadn't had yet, our now grown children, were in our 20s. The fall light, even in the south of France, so ecologically similar to our Southern California, with its rocky, dry hills and opulent bougainvillea, seemed ratcheted down several notches from the light I was used to, and the wind howled sometimes, echoing in the shafts of our apartment building. The combination of overcast skies and occasionally surprising cold brought me viscerally back to my Eastern U.S. childhood, the fear of cold, the desire for the pleasure of warmth. Indeed, the apartment felt gray, gloomy, and full of chill. I was unused to the night and day of shuttered windows when I awoke, longing for full flooding sunlight like a spoiled Californian, sunlight to bask in. And inevitably, French was there every day, with its foreignness, a small hill to climb, a detour to manage, a rut in the road to watch out for. After a while, lonely, only able to work for a certain length of time each day, and not always to work well, we gave ourselves over to the new slowness of our lives. We spent long afternoons wheeling our chariot, that's what the French call the supermarket cart, around and around the hypermarché, it's like a supermarket, which was called Mammouth. We were devoid of the technical vocabulary or too embarrassed to try to ask for rubbing alcohol with the paints, it turns out, or which of the endless varieties of creme fraiche might approximate sour cream, or whether there was any margarine without butter in it. We took slow walks to the post office, a little speech about rates and insurance, rehearsing itself in my head if I have a present to mail home. I spent hours planning a phone conversation with a couple who had invited us to call. They'd offered their assistance in the hypermarché. And hours getting up the nerve to actually make the call because, of course, Without visible gestures and facial expressions, speaking and being understood in a language you have an uncertain command of is that much harder. I can't say exactly when those slow hours began to glow because French was there, and we had begun to accept and even enjoy the inevitable simplification, while occasionally having to wrestle with the complications that resulted from failing to understand so much. And I can't say exactly when that glow heightened because French was successfully climbed over, detoured around, managed. Living in a foreign language is automatically a life simplifier. It's as if in your own country you are receiving 100 channels and suddenly you are reduced to just a few. You are inside an isolation chamber like a contestant on a 60s quiz show. Street shouts, conversations in the department store elevator as you ascend, the buzz of TV can all be easily ignored because they require an active will to process. Such a life is also disturbing at first because your own cultural identity is shared only with the person you are with. Only he or she knows who you are. In your isolation chamber, you are an island culture of two, surrounded by a sea of French, reliant only on each other for the full range of human interactions spread out at home among other relatives or friends or colleagues. Ultimately, we grew accustomed to the absence of stimuli, the phone that rarely rang, the lack of email. We began to appreciate the possibility of hearing our own thoughts, even of re-seeing each other. But living in France, of course, requires and invites venturing outside the isolation chamber, approximating being a member of a community. And there, whatever else I was doing, debating between olives with fennel, sorry about the phone, and olives with chili, or admiring the baby of the couple from the Hypermarché, who were delighted we'd called and invited us to dinner. I was also, in measured and tolerable doses, speaking French, and most pleasantly elevated to the stature of #1 researcher, informant, and translator for my lavishly competent and knowledgeable, but not in French, husband. Speaking French began to give my days enormous focus and a constant sense of accomplishment, a constant sense of checking off to-dos on a list, as well as moments of utter annoyance, with my husband loudly whispering in my ear, "What is he saying? What? Tell him he's got it wrong." It was as if I had one book to focus my days on, one book to hold on to, the book of French, which made me ignore a multitude of other books I might have leafed through, fancied I should read, or have read. There was a certain simplicity and completeness, a certain peacefulness in having one book. I thought of the ancients who, before the age of material print culture, before the proliferation of books, made an important text truly theirs by memorizing it, and then could endlessly refer to it, find everything they needed into it, locate themselves through it, even use it for divination, be comforted by it. This is true of the Iliad and the Odyssey. I think later on, even for Virgil's Aeneid. The words passing before my mind's eye, even the simplest of them, like T, T-H-E with an accent, AQ or acute accent for T, with their rakish accents, their smart little hats, had an aura. It went with the pastel curls of ribbon on the white boxes from the pastry shop, La Pâtisserie, the white frills on the rack of lamb in the butcher shop, the general sense of ceremony that accompanied life, particularly the taking of meals. Everything is aestheticized in France, one can almost say relentlessly aestheticized. under some kind of penalty to be an aesthetic object, particularly if not only women and the things connected with them. I felt, as I spoke French and was spoken to, as if I were contributing to that decorativeness. Could this have been simply because the French had successfully sold themselves to me as the epitome of cachet, successfully exported a glamorous view of their privileged selves from the time I first pasted a magazine picture of La Tour Eiffel on my fourth grade report cover? And because I was really a snob, this was the European country which, sure enough, had sent the smallest group of immigrants to the US. Oh, but it was good that they still pretended they hadn't learned any English and still tried to legislate against their language going the way of Le Weekend and Le Drugstore, so that I could have the pleasure of eating goose liver pâté. That's P-A with a little hat, the circumflex, and then a little feather over the E, in a little restaurant with a briefly flashed chalkboard menu, and at the same time could savor the word gliding along my mental blackboard with its adorable little hat and feather at a jaunty angle, while my husband might well have been thinking, pate, no accents, P-A-T-A-Y. Of course, in the marriage cocoon isolation chamber, I didn't feel the relentlessness of the aestheticization as did the young, unattached American computer artist working in Marseille I met at a dinner hosted by the polyglot anthropologist. She was disgusted by the endlessness of naked women in ads for skin cream and chocolate, the endlessness of la maîtresse, the mistress, on the side, as would be my own daughter a year later as a student in a very touristy town. She would tell me that the young women she met at parties often seemed too careful, afraid to enjoy themselves, to drink enough to get a little high at a party, for example, for fear of spoiling the tableau they presented. I did notice how a good number of women who seemed to be pushing 80 never let go, still wearing stiletto heels and stockings with clocks as they clicked down the street in front of our apartment, where dog shit and perfume characteristically assaulted the nose with equal pungency. But for us, there was finally only pleasure in the aestheticization of human interaction in France. Contrary to their press, we found the French almost ineluctably charming, polite, and imbued with a highly developed sense of host-guest relations, though perhaps at times we thought masking some interior sadness. Theirs does seem to be a culture of valuing charm over probity. Speaking French made me enjoy being charmed and desire to be charming. And how easy that is when no one really knows who you are. I suppose my creditable accent and not my impoverished vocabulary and limited sense of the finer points of grammar, such as the subjunctive, was my charm. Hearing myself in my mind's ear as I rehearsed my speeches with salespeople, postal clerks, and ticket agents, or as I spoke and was understood, I almost charmed myself with my accent, rather as I attempt to charm myself away from negative self-reflection by smiling at myself in the mirror, a habit my beautiful young daughter found amusingly weird. I did feel some of the friends we made were silently correcting for my errors because they understood enough about the structure of English to grasp the intent behind mistakes English speakers make when trying to speak French, though not a word of English escaped their lips. But at least they weren't wincing. My husband even received linguistic compliments when he tried out a few phrases with the sausage seller at his cart in the hypermarché. Ah, the South, where, as they themselves say, people are warmer. Our landlords from the North also said that a friend made in the North was a friend forever, while a Southern friend could smile and forget you immediately. I guess that was their Northern warmth. If we required incipient Francophilia to get ourselves to France for almost a year, We had it for real, most likely the key ingredient of our charm, after a sufficient number of trips to that hypermarché. The cheese counter stretched from here to gastronomic eternity, and each sample was more excruciatingly delicious than the last. And as we told each other, their lamb tasted more lamby, their chicken more chickeny than anything we'd ever hoped to experience, requiring only tiny portions for full satisfaction that we satisfied our American selves with over and over. Charm even oozed out of the most modestly employed. Teenage servers at McDonald's, for example. Could it be that because they were living in the known center of the universe, they were spilling over with goodwill and desire to please? Monsieur, Madame, with the characteristic rising intonation, rang out at the beginning and end of every conceivable transaction, even no sale. Even the dentist, whose bad root canal and crown cost me a molar, came personally to the waiting room to get me, bowed slightly in greeting, saw me to the door after my ordeal, and wished me a good weekend. He maintained his charming politeness until I experienced real distress at the technologically dated impression goo locking my jaws for 7 minutes and causing me to gag big time, at which point he got slightly hysterical. But most of the time, charm prevailed, and conversations with service people and friends alike, glowing for me with their subtext, Vraiment, je parle français. Truly, I'm speaking French. Easily tracked the route of compliment and didn't stray too far from it, even when cautiously substantive. Perhaps pleasantries are virtually all that is possible in an imperfectly mastered foreign tongue. The charm, as well as the easy accessibility of medical professionals in particular, was sometimes so palpable it was actually embarrassing for one more accustomed to routine brusqueness. I had some troubling symptoms in France, which resulted in a gynecological exam and later an ultrasound of my uterus. The gynecologist performed the ultrasound himself in his office. Doctors greeted as Monsieur and Madame and not Docteur, just as they greeted their patients, seemed to be far less august and priestly figures in France, and had few technicians to do auxiliary work for them. This one was remarkably handsome, which didn't help at all. As he moved the ultrasound wand across my plumpish belly, I was suddenly taken by acute apologetics for my excessive flesh in the land of the genetically thin, and blurted out something about un peu grosse, a little fat. Mais non, but no, exclaimed Monsieur M. Pas du tout, not at all. And then something like, c'est nécessaire, or il faut avoir, it's necessary, or you need to have. And seeming to cross the doctor and courtier or shooter wires, causing me to lose the remainder of his sentence and blushing hotly crawl inside my head in a paroxysm of embarrassment. Were our increasing experiences of delight, even the gynecologist was cherishable, of course, simply the mirrors of the francophilia we increasingly projected as we grew more in love with this savory and fragrant hiatus contained in new accents from our everyday lives and tensions, becoming more and more accustomed to once strange textures and rhythms as our remaining weeks diminished. Where could one find someone so aimable, nice, as the man behind the counter, even at the little local market across the street, who, with graciousness and indeed a kind of measured enjoyment, was always willing to give a little disquisition on the flavors and best accompaniments of his relatively small selection of cheeses. Of course, I usually began by saying how much I loved all the ones he'd sold me before, and we were, unlike my student daughter, the only Americans in town. Where could one find such delightful friends as the French family we fell into a kind of dinner and outing schedule with, and invited to meet our American friends when they passed through, and with whom we exchanged such charming hostess gifts, such sincerely meant, oh, you really shouldn't have. But would we have so enjoyed these acquaintances? Would we have made these same friends if they didn't speak French? For me, speaking French was a little like an infusion of youth, a reminder of that time when, confident of beauty, sure of the spotlight, one lived and at the same time glamorously watched oneself living as if on a stage. When we returned to France, this time to Normandy, which we'd never seen, for a brief week and some days, 4 years after living there, I had to take the language out of mothballs, air it out, try it on again. After a day or two, after a few tastes of bread and cheese that reawakened taste buds I thought were forever dead, after a pleasant conversation with an hotelier originally from the South, I began to find that place in my mouth and mind again, the pleasure of knowing the few subtleties I know. Baguette, fromage, but our visits are inevitably few and far apart, and I am not a polyglot. So when I go again, I will undoubtedly be blissfully unable to forget that I am speaking French. And I have to ask you if I have time to read the poem that follows this essay.
Yes, please. I really want to hear an essay and a poem
Yes,
from
because
this.
the poems are all placed in a very deliberate way in relation to the essay, and sometimes they are the opposite case. So the positioning is really crucial. And this poem is in many ways the opposite case and a lot ruder in the beginning, as you'll see, than the essay. And it's about 2 minutes. So it's called Charm. And as I say, it begins rather rudely. Is it possible to charm the spouse who's heard you fart in bed? The child you've screamed at? Isn't charm only a long white glove removed, fingers extended, charmed, I'm sure, kind of thing? And didn't Jeffrey Dahmer have it? And Ted Bundy? My freshman year boyfriend, the slick dancer from a lovely New England home back in the double standard 60s, almost charmed the pants off my prim mother, and I learned later had been engaged in the gang rape of a towny girl. It's enough to make you put on tiger skins and seek the desert. Yet sometimes I cannot feel my face until I put on my smiling interaction mask. Alone in my blue room, stewing in my own juices, I begin to dissolve, then evaporate. I need the press of others to make me condense, though my attempt at charm, fashioned to interface, can feel like an invader surrounded by leukocytes, utterly resisted. Still, talking on the phone this morning, asking a favor of a friend, I felt my cheeks chunk up with goodwill and my internal organs all peacefully nestle. This afternoon, even my dog put on the dog of good behavior, heeling properly as if trained, when my visiting grandson held his leash for his walk. And as I apply my lip gloss and blush this evening before going out, bizarrely I smile at myself, trying to disarm my deep doubt, charmer and charmed at once. Bless us all, social beasts that we are. We dish up smiles. We laugh in self-deprecation as we flick cookie crumbs from our lips. We try to lift our blue-footed booby feet in sync with the potential mates, to lubricate the wheels of social traffic with our luscious dimples, as if we could soften the world and shape it to our needs, our moon faces beaming on our compatriots, dark sides sweetly hidden. So quite the opposite.
Woo, damn. Judy.
Yeah, quite the opposite, right?
I'm so glad you did that because thank you so much, number one, for reading that essay. It was really fascinating as someone that knows you through your poetry to hear the essays. And I loved it. I love the fact that the poet is there, creating these insights and this beautiful, luscious landscape of language. But the essays showed something different to me, and I love that. And then the poem, of course, one thing, the titling, and boy, sometimes your last line, I'm like, did not see that coming. Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, it was fun
fabulous.
because, I was using poems, in previous books or poems previously published, and just I was able to choose. It surprised me how I was able to choose something that really sparks with the essay, so that was fun actually.
So
Yeah.
actually, you've just hit upon something that Hetty and I were talking about prior to getting started. And it was really about the construction, of how, and I'm going to let Hetty ask the question because she was much more graceful in the language. So if you don't mind, Hetty.
Just, I found this essay fascinating, and the combination, the contrast, and you charmed us. That's all I can say. And
I'm glad.
all the different nuances of, using the charm or losing it was magnificent. And we were talking with Malaika about, I was wondering how did you come about organizing and the book? How many poems are you alternating? What was, how did you go about?
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, really, organizing the book was like discovering the themes of your life that already existed and had mostly been examined and uh, presented in essays that have been published over the course of essays, almost 30 years, really. So it was like looking at the whole self because I never read them all together. And there are some themes that carry through, but a little bit of ambivalence is one of the themes, to be honest. So that even in, and I think that just reflects life long and complex enough to look at both sides and to feel both sides. So, and to be honest about it, I suppose, and want to really understand myself and to speak truthfully about how I felt. So, what I noticed in terms of organization was that there was many of the themes had this looking at one side, looking at the other side. So in the French essay, there's the discomfort of being in a strange place when you're really trying to live there. Just that unease. And then there's perhaps this weird thing that I have as always having been a good student. I mean, I just think I got so much pleasure out of managing to speak in a way where people didn't laugh in my face that, I was so focused on that I really was thinking about how I felt about that all the time. And I've never been good enough to lose that. So the blessings of incompetence. Or, people who forget that they're speaking another language when they speak it. I've never I got almost there that year because it was 9 months. But in my return trips, I'm afraid, in fact, the people that we met there, they were really lovely. It's a whole story about how we met them. But we did see them very frequently. And when we returned to France one year, and their circumstances had changed. The husband was in a halfway house. He had a mental breakdown. It was awful sad, terribly sad. But we saw the wife and one of the children again, and she told me my French was nowhere near as good as it was previously. So, you have to reclaim it. You have to be there long enough to remember what you remember. And when you're first there, you know, that doesn't
I
happen.
had a question. When you picked up the essays that you decided you were going to use as you were rereading the whole thing, to me, it reminds me when I read, I always kept a journal, and sometimes after a few years, I would spend 2, 3 days just rereading a bunch of, writings written over a
Yeah.
few. Well, that's like rereading your journals. When you picked some of these essays, have you composed new poems in response to them, or did you only use the ones that echoed?
Yeah, I did not compose new poems for this. No, I had so many that seemed to jibe that, and it was, you know, I have to say it was easier, of course, to put a book together from mostly previously published essays. But what surprised me was the continuities. I mean, the desire to understand the self, and this kind of honest, I suppose, somebody called it graceful, but thank you very much, someone. the, the ambivalence about, you know, certain life experiences, which just comes from telling people what you felt about them, really. So, I mean, and then certain themes were repeated. Now, one of the major themes of this collection is, and one I didn't, you know, touch at all in reading this particular essay, was my feeling of apartness from the foundationally Protestant country that we live in. And my parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. I was a profoundly class conscious child. We lived in a tiny apartment in the Bronx. I won a scholarship to the Smith College Club, which was awarded by these ladies wearing suits and white gloves who had to come to our apartment. And you know, it was astonishingly class consciousness raising. You know, they took off their white gloves and each accepted one cookie, and my mother served an entire coffee table full of food. So, you know, that's my ultimate background. And so I certainly was very class conscious, and I certainly was. My relationship to my own ethnicity and religion is very complicated. And there's ambivalence and there's growth. But I'm honest about all of that in this collection. I'll probably always have certain ambivalences. It's just how I'm constructed. So that's one theme. And that apartness, a sense of not being at home, it occurs in other essays. So, for example, when my mother kept kosher, she was very traditional. And even when my parents gave me the blessing of moving out here in their 70s, moving out to California, so that my children got to have grandparents. It was an astonishing and wonderful thing. But she was a very old world sort of person. And when she was ill, and you know, they were pretty old when they were here, so often I was helping care for her when she was ill. And she had some mysterious symptoms. The doctor was very worried. She was, you know, admitted into the hospital for tests, and being in the hospital, I mean, it's even from my husband and me at this age, when we're almost the age she was then, it's, you know, disorienting to begin with. And she had that kind of elder situation where you just lose your sense of reality completely. And then she was trying to deal with things that were, I know, were extremely difficult for her because she did not eat the food that other people ate. And so when they wanted to give her the menu and they had shellfish, sorry, but she was too uncomfortable to sort of say it straightforwardly. So that in itself was this weird kind of feeling of apartness. because neither my mother nor I could be straightforward in this environment, which nobody knew what being kosher meant, you know.
Yeah.
So a tiny little thing in a way, but it made that whole experience for her. It was only one tiny part of it, but it made it that much more difficult. And the way she responded was not unrelated to a weirdness in the way I respond to being different, which is not being able to really be out front, but sort of being hiding and being a little embarrassed, which is kind of awful, but just being truthful, you know. So that's a theme that runs through a lot of
I think it's the honesty with which you look at yourself. And I experienced in that essay the blackboard and the language scrolling across it, but also of a sense of how we can be apart from oneself. Like there's the apart from the language or our routine and how everything like comes into like when people are outside of their bubble, comfort zone, whatever. But I deeply admire, and I think somebody already wrote this. Yeah, Hetty did. I admire your honesty, and I love that you truly like examine, these are the lens. This is what I see through. I love that. And I wanted to highlight, you'll see the chat section and see all our kudos, but yeah, you're going to enjoy this. But I wanted to highlight what Regina said about your poetic mind seems to show up in the essay. It's the best of both worlds.
Thank you, Regina. That's so kind. Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that so much. I'm not a writer who's written thousands of essays. So when I put these together, I had basically most of the ones that I'd written. But I think because I wrote academic essays earlier on, I had spent so much time trying to organize complex material, which took so much more work than writing personal essays, I have to say. So much more work. And because I'd written a critical book, which took me 20 years, that writing personal essays felt just marvelously releasing. I mean, I think I did less revision. I did some, I always revise. I am a great reviser, but much less than what's involved in wrestling academic material into shape, So, so it was a pleasure for me to kind of see what I'd done. I kind of didn't realize it because I thought, I published a few essays, but I didn't realize that they kind of came together, in terms of some repeated thematic motifs and just the attitude towards the self, I think, as well.
Judy, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
And when I started to travel because I needed to see the world, and one of the first countries was France. And I actually went because you had this disassociation between who you were and the new you that spoke French. I actually very often had to use that opportunity to absolutely reinvent myself.
Mm-hmm.
Did you do that too?
Well, I don't think it was so much a reinvention as the actual, where this Francophilia came from, I can't exactly say, but it was there. And I think it really was that that I am always in love with language. And so being the way it feels to say things, the way the words look on the page, I think that because I had, I learned some Spanish by living in Mexico for a while, but I never studied it formally. So French was the only language, and you had so many, Rose, but French was the only language that I had more than a passing acquaintance with. So I think in a sense, a kind of accident, but I just love the act of using a foreign language. I don't think I could simply reinvent myself, but I think I was continually enjoying the fact that I could manage to communicate when I did. It was just such a delightful experience. You know, Americans are that way, aren't they? I mean, compared to Europeans who are surrounded by other languages and always know a few, you know. But this is the only one I really invested my energies into. So it kind of made me feel great to use it.
It was also completely different because you're actually talking about this culture of two. You could always go home and talk to your husband in English. Whereas when I started out, I got so tired sometimes because there was just no escaping. I had to use the other language. The only other thing I had was think to myself. And that's what happened to me with English. Because I didn't really dare to write in English until I had been in England for about 15 years.
Well, it's amazing though. I mean,
and now I think and breathe, but I remember that time when I thought I won't survive this. This is just too much.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. I'm probably being forced to speak the language always is what makes you learn it. But you know, I had what I had.
No, absolutely brilliant and very. I just wanted to say I really smiled, like somebody said, I smiled throughout that essay and enjoyed it tremendously.
Yeah, I have to say I get pleasure from the fact that the essays in this book, and some of them are more, you know, more serious subjects, but and there's loss, you know, but there's an element of humor in most of them, I think. So I think it's
that's in your nature.
I think it's incredible how I've used up the whole hour with you guys. Oh my goodness.
Thoroughly, obviously we've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Judy, this is no and Karen's the one, Rose, who had said my cheeks, you know, from yeah, somebody else said you charmed us.
Yeah,
truly
Karen
charmed
said
us.
that, I think.
Yeah,
I'm doing
yeah,
myself,
lovely.
mine are hot.
So can we just take a moment to say thank you, Judy? Does anybody have any other questions or?
Well, you've been such a lovely group.
Yeah.
Well, could I just say, hi, I'm Suzanne. I thought that the specificity of how your tongue was working in your mouth and how you're trying to use the nasal and all of that really captured that apartness, you know, in a really beautiful way, because it's not just that we're in a place where you didn't speak the language thoroughly or all that, but it was just like your whole physical being trying to, and having been to a French school for 12 years, the fact that they act, and I speak pretty damn well, they always answer me in English. No, they always answer me in English when I go to France. So it's pretty amazing that they actually, you know, responded to you in French. That's a great credit to your skill.
I think it was the time, Suzanne, because when we've gone back, you know, this was quite a while ago, and it's changed. There's much more speaking French get answered in English.
Except and the fact that they were charming to you.
Oh, like well, they were. I always think it's because I'm projecting so much love of them that, you know, they haven't got, well, not in the north, not in Paris in August, forget it.
Well, it's true. On the south, they are nicer in the south, but.
And we this whole time was in the south, and people were really nice. And the one time I made somebody, I guess the last time we were in France, which there's another essay about this because I broke my wrist in France. That's another interesting whole story. It's the last essay in the book, and it's also both funny and still interesting. Anyway, when we were it was in Brittany in 2017. We were at this tiny little hotel with a really super nice restaurant, and I wound up having a deal with the hotelier there. The hotelier, he wanted to practice his English, and I wanted to practice my French. He spoke French and he spoke English. I mean, that's the only deal I could make. Otherwise, it was too often. But this is a small town, so actually, I correct myself. In very small towns, no English, but in any larger town, certainly in Paris, you know, you could speak French until you're blue in the face, and they're still going to talk to you in English.
Yeah, they're not very friendly in Paris, not at all.
No.
I mean, it's another world.
Yeah, I mean, we intended to stay away from from
cities.
Paris after we found such delight in these small towns over the
I
years.
think that's generally true for the big cities. London isn't England. New York is not America. Paris is not France. Amsterdam is not Holland.
Yeah.
I think it's generally true.
People are more brusque in the big cities. Yeah.
I went to France many years ago for about a week with a Canadian, and he spoke French fluently. I mean, he had spoken French all his life, but with a Quebec accent. And the Parisians
Forget
would
it.
not deal
It
with
would
him. I
happen.
mean, they just shrugged their shoulders. They pretended they
I
couldn't
didn't
understand
understand it.
what
Yeah,
he was
I
saying.
know.
Cat,
So
it's
I
not an
ended up
accent. It's
being the
not an accent.
communicator, and
It's
I had
not an accent.
never studied French. I didn't know any French when I arrived in Paris. So he would tell me what to say, and I would try to.
Oh my goodness.
But Quebecois, no, it's not French.
No,
No,
it's
it's
another.
really
No,
different.
it's different.
It's
I know.
old French. It's old French.
Yeah.
When you
I
watch,
know. I read a book about the difference, a study of Jack Kerouac by Hassan Malehi recently, and it was fascinating, really.
you
Kerouac
watch a
was
French
very
movie,
Quebecois.
if you watch in France in a French channel, a Canadian movie, you have French subtitles.
Yeah.
So that tells you everything. I mean, my
Right.
brother and sister are in Montreal.
funny.
I've been in Montreal for 40 years. So, yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
That's a
that's
great detail.
When I would
Well,
talk over the phone with my sister-in-law, who is Quebecoise, and our first language is French.
right.
Okay, we're fluent in French. We grew up with French, although we're from Lebanon and Egypt. But every time I talk to my sister-in-law, I have to be very patient because then she would ask me, "Tu comprends? Tu comprends?" Because sometimes I'm ashamed to tell her I haven't understood because it's different.
Yeah. It's always embarrassing to say you haven't understood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. It's just.
Well, we will head towards open mic. I
Let's do
have
it.
Rose, Karen, Hetty, Cal, and Regina. If you have changed your mind and would like to read, let me know. Rose, I have your name first.
Well, I'm happy to, but I have to confess that listening to Judy, I changed the poem I was about to read.
Really?
And now I'm reading a poem that was published in MacQueen's Quinterly.
Great.
And that was an ode to smelly cheese.
How appropriate.
And here's the poem. Starting with the least offensive, you work your way slowly up the intensity scale. Beginning with the Camembert de Normandie, you move on via a gentle brie de mots to a powerful bleu, a Roquefort perhaps. When you can barely talk because your mouth is full and because you didn't know how much wine is needed to neutralize the reblochon, your eyes, your nose, and your taste buds, which stay alert throughout, lead the knife in your hand towards the Münster and the Vieux Boulogne, avoiding the Pont-l'Évêque, Livarot et Banon, because you just can't eat anymore. And because you haven't made it yet to Napoleon's favorite, Époisse de Bourgogne. Historians have never asked themselves whether the secret of his military success may not have been that he was driving the armies of Europe downwind.
That's lovely.
That's fabulous.
I love it.
Did not expect that.
I couldn't help it. I mean, after Judy's, I had a very serious one.
Oh.
But after Judy's essay, I couldn't resist.
But you went with sticky cheese. Thank you, Rose. Karen, I have you next.
Gosh, I wish I had something that tied into Judy's reading tonight. I'm so jealous. All I've got is some fresh ink, so I'm just going to go with that. This is from Titles Uprising from Michael Heddich's Halo of Bees. Moon blooms, such a tease of light. My hands are flowers offering whatever nectar I might be made up of. The point of touching this air with these breaths is housekeeping for this soul I am housing. Any chickadee knows there is not a single simple tree. Night turns the philosopher in me inside out. Midnight is mid-spring's frolicsome time, the sound of midsummer's gentle envy. The soon of common loons celebrating the anniversary of the modern dance, of their turning after months of careful deliberation. Of the layers I have piled between flesh and chill, I beckon. La Luna, abide within me, accept my huddling. Behind our memories, we exert light. I am outing myself in cheers to your brilliant moon shine.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. I am outing myself. Ah, there's so much in there, Karen. That's fabulous. And the point of touching this hair. I love that.
Gorgeous.
I have Hetty next.
Oh, well, I also second Rose. I had a very serious poem that I wrote recently, and I prefer to write a poem about my trip to Prague 10 years ago, which inspired many poems. And this one was published a year ago by the Cortland Review. And it kind of ties in a little bit with your experience with French in some ways. So the poem is Having Dinner at the Mosaica restaurant in Prague. Mark Rothko's Subway series projects the onlooker onto each canvas alongside elongated silhouettes of men and women, oblivious of their surroundings, as though immersed in their inner world. As I entered these existential scenes as one of the isolated travelers, I was transported back to my descent into Prague's metro, aware that I wouldn't be able to pronounce any word in Czech. I held on tight to a piece of paper with the name of the station. I kept trying to say these words aloud just in case I'd lose it. But every time I'd stop passers-by to check my pronunciation, they would laugh and make me repeat the address. The long descent in the metro's steep escalator conjured up my worst nightmares. I kept checking the other side of the escalator to make sure I could find my way up, as I felt immersed in a movie in which people were condemned to the underworld. I later learned that Prague's fast-moving escalators led to tunnels used for protection against nuclear weapons. I wasn't comforted to face the rush of people getting out of the compartment's doors, lost in thought as in Rothko's paintings, and tried to ask someone if this metro was headed to the address on my paper. I arrived in time to meet my poet friends at the Mosaica, relieved that we would all return to the hotel together.
Yes. And I think it captures that apartness and that sense of out of body experience and how things just, yes.
Nice.
Yeah, I love what you chose out of there, Karen. I kept checking the other side of the escalator, lost in thought as in Rothko's painting. Yeah. And carrying a piece of paper. Gosh. No, and I love that people, and that's interesting to me, Judy. Most of the time people have a poem and occasionally you'll see them change, people will say, oh, I changed it to respond to, but there's been several. So
Yeah.
that's of interest to me. I have Cal and then Regina.
Cal.
Okay. Yeah, this is one of the very few haibun that I've written, and I managed to get it published. It's called A Moment. Green dogwood and beech sway slowly in breeze. Crow's shadow, bigger than the bird, moves across the lumpy meadow full of buttercups. Mama Mouse pokes between sawgrass tufts, hides from predator bird. No color in sky but shades of blue. Sea air floats in from past the low ridge. Late afternoon rain moves on with small, solitary tea cell. And the haiku is drain spout drips in time with nothing.
I like that. I like that. Thank you. And Regina, and I want to point out that Regina has put the link to Multiverse, her newest collection, with Aquarius Press. And so, yeah, there we go. There's the cover. Thanks,
I
Regina.
agree. I was gonna read from Multiverse, but then I realized I was like, oh, I'm missing an opportunity here. I have a Paris poem. I have one person. And I'm gonna go quickly because anyway. So the title of this poem, I went to Paris. I'm trying to remember 2018. I think it was 2018. And it was London. It was a London and Paris trip. And so this poem is entitled Black Streets of Paris. Some years ago on the streets of Paris, I implored the tour guide to take me to the place where my people could be found. My people, Black, like me. When I arrived, I saw racks and tables lining Black streets, lined with Black people speaking fluid French with thick Senegalese accents, heavy Nigerian accents, melodic Malayan accents, beautiful African accents from my people, like Black, like me. I walked in anticipation and power as I thought about my DNA tests, riddled with teasing predictions regarding who I am genetically. 65 to 75% African, multiple African ethnicities, essentially Black, unequivocally Black, quintessently Black, like me. I looked around and down those adorned peopled Black streets, and I marveled at my people, Black and seemingly unafraid, living in this place far removed from their own native lands, savvy and courageous, setting up a human communication alert system, a chain from block to block to let their fellow vendors know, La police arrive, so that they might pick up and run with their goods hastily gathered when the police would come through to shut down unlicensed vendors and take the blocks back, making those streets less Black, only upon police departure to reemerge, to come back, goods in hand, Black, like me. I saw them scramble out and then flow back in, focused with minimal loss, or words, straight business, undeterred, fire, burnished Black, persistent Black, African immigrants, Black like me. One gleaming tall man with skin like ebony teak wood, swinging heavy locks, approached our group, made up of our guide, white, French, fellow travelers, another female faculty member, American, white, a brother and a sister duo, American, Black, like me. Of course, he, the vendor, was promoting his motherland-made and acquired wares. He quickly flipped his tongue from French to English without pause. Impressed, I heard him ask the brother and sister in our group where they were from. They too, tall and gleaming, visages like deep, rich earthen gods. The vendor explained that they looked like his people. He gave them his place, his culture, his ethnicity. I stood in awe, covetous. I wanted to be named, a people, a dance, customs, food, song, dress. I waited for a moment.
so as not to disturb this beautiful sub-Saharan African impromptu naming ceremony. And then I said, where do I look like I'm from? As if he could place in the world all people Black like me. It must have been in that moment, or it could have been every moment before, that maybe the 25 to 35% of my Euro-Asiatic indigenous American DNA stood up. And the naming God of this Paris street said to me, New York. My face burned as I fell back into the nebulous, momentarily stripped of my African, oft denied American identity. I've learned much since that day about who I am and how I am seen outside the walls of this land in Pan-African spaces, Eastern North Carolina girl that I am. And I have come to the conclusion that Black like me ain't always the same for everybody.
Yeah.
Oh, Regina,
Yeah.
I have to ask you all, I have to ask you all for permission, and I make it short.
Yeah.
But in Paris, for the first time in my life, I was 18 when I was there the first time, I met Black for the first time.
Oh, wow.
And we were sitting in a cafe, and these two guys, elegant and ebony, as
Yeah.
Black as they could possibly be, with white shirts. And it was brilliant. It was evening. And we met, and we stood on the Seine on one of the bridges, and we put our hands next to each other, and we looked, and we were just fascinated by our differences. It was such an amazing moment.
Right.
And it's in my heart. I've never forgotten it. We never met again. I mean, it was just this one moment.
Right. Right. That's the beauty of travel. You find out about other people, but you also found out some things about yourself and where
Yes.
you are in the world. I am aware that there are some countries, let's say, for example, like South Africa, who people are groups. So like people that I look at and I would say, oh, they're Black like me, they're considered something else. They're considered like colored. Like I wouldn't be in the place in the the place where I would think I would be because maybe of my complexion or something else. It's very interesting, and it's interesting how yeah. I mean, I descend from some Louisiana Creoles, some French Acadians as well. And so it is just all of that is just
It's
fascinating, but I will never
absolutely
ever forget that.
fascinating,
That's
wonderful.
all, huh?
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, wonderful. And this is why I have still hope for this world, because maybe we can still put it together. Maybe when I'm dead, I'm old now, so I'm on the way out. But maybe my kids can still put it together, But I'm nearly 90, so I mean, I'm definitely on the other side of.
You look so
You
beautiful,
look great.
Yeah, I was gonna say
You look great.
all that
You
one.
look young. You look young like a flower.
My God.
Yes.
I'm going to be 87 this April, so
Well, that's not too much. I'm not very far behind you.
Well,
you can't be
this is
Eddie.
the age honesty moment. I will be 82 this July.
Oh,
So.
wow.
Wow.
That's such
Never would have known. I
wow.
wanted to jump, Regina, that you chose that poem to me kind of brings this to a really beautiful closure space. And what I saw everybody doing was like self-reflection, self kind of curiosity, and how things can throw us in or out of our awareness of how we are in the world. And it almost sounds like some people were saying, I did this on purpose or I came across it, but either way, those moments, and I admire the honesty with which people examine the self, say, this is, what I see. And I think what Rose was saying about having hope, I think that's where the hope comes from, is people who not only are big on rights, but understand responsibilities, who don't just exterior, you know, they bring this reflection interior.
And wonder.
Yes, and wonder, curiosity and wonder and awe.
Thank God that we're not losing the wonder and the ability of keeping our young selves alive within ourselves. This is what's saving us. This is what saves the world, is to keep having this kind of fresh look at things and this introspection, so that we can never be in an enclosed, you know, like what's going on right now.
Yes, and there is, I'm going to read something and then we will close, but thank you for that, because you just reminded me of, there's a book called Black Liturgies that I've just ordered because I am obsessed. And I'm going to read one quote because it kind of, to me, feels like what we're talking about. It can feel foolish to pause to marvel at the stars when the world is burning, or to find the world beautiful when you've known it to betray you. But wonder is a liberation practice, a reminder that we contain more than tragedy. Beauty is our origin and our anchor.
Wow.
So,
thank you
thank
so
y'all.
much. This is so important.
Yes. Thank y'all for being such amazing company. And Judy, as always, I love your poetic sonic structure and your honesty and showing up. Beautiful.
I go back to Lima full of the most wonderful feeling. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all
Thank you.
so much. Lovely to see you all, really, truly.
Be well.